Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Richard Fontaine, CEO at the Center for New American Security. I'd like to welcome everyone to the discussion today of law enforcement, homeland security, and intelligence in the coming Biden administration and Biden era. This session pulls together several critical issues, all of which are moving targets in the Trump administration's final weeks and as we head into this new political era. And to discuss them, we have a great group with us. Jeh Johnson is the former Secretary of Homeland Security and served as General Counsel of the Department of Defense, among other positions in government. He also represents New Jersey in a 7-state council that coordinates COVID-related reopening. Sue Gordon is the former Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, the nation's second highest intelligence post, and she served in the intelligence community for over 3 decades in a variety of senior positions. And Carrie Cordero is the Robert Gates Senior Fellow at CNAS and the organization's general counsel. When she was in government, she served at the Department of Justice and in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. So it's a great group that we've got to discuss today. We're going to start with a conversation among us, and then we'll move to some audience questions, which you can enter in the Q&A box on your screen. And we'll also have a few polling questions, as we've done in our past couple of sessions, that we'll weave in throughout so we can get a sense of what the audience thinks about some of the things and some of the topics. But let's start with Homeland Security. And Jeh, I'll go to you first. Despite the really broad array of responsibilities that DHS has, the Trump administration's focused heavily on immigration and border security enforcement as the sort of signature policy priority of the administration. In your mind, what will or what should the Biden administration do to recalibrate the policy focus of the department? Are there areas that have been overweighted, neglected, that need some sort of recalibration?
Hey, Richard, thanks for having me on. Thanks for including me in this program. And I am a proud board member of CNAS. It's a terrific organization. To all of those who are listening in, I have to begin by saying I was very, very pleased with the news a few minutes ago that Ali Mayorkas, the former Deputy Secretary of DHS, is President-elect Biden's choice to be the Secretary of DHS. Ali's got a well-rounded experience with the Department of Homeland Security. He ran USCIS. He was the Deputy Secretary years ago. He was U.S. Attorney in Southern California. So I can't think of anyone more qualified to take on the leadership of DHS. So when I was in office for 3 years, I constantly sought to remind the public and the Congress that DHS is much more than immigration enforcement. DHS is aviation security, it's cybersecurity, it's port security, it's maritime security. It's essentially protecting the American people and the homeland on the 1-yard line. And people inside the Beltway very often overlook the fact that what's on the mind of most Americans is it safe for me to travel? Is it safe for my daughter or son on spring break to travel someplace? And that's what Americans really care about. And so they care about aviation security, they care about maritime security, they care about the full range of things that DHS does to protect the American public. And I think the more the next leadership team does the same, the more it will help to restore the credibility of DHS, which has really taken a battering over the last 4 years because, as you pointed out, immigration has been the signature issue of the entire Trump administration. And DHS has been used as the hammer for driving that mission. There is a way to enforce our immigration laws in a sensible, compassionate way while pursuing immigration reform here in this country. Ali knows how to do that. I'm confident that he will take on that mission in a very competent way. But it's important to remember the reason DHS was created was in the wake of 9/11, essentially for counterterrorism. So it protects the department in all sorts of different ways. Over. Sorry about that.
No problem. No problem. Let me just follow up on that, and then I want to get Sue's take on this as well, which, as you said, DHS founded and created after 9/11 to prevent another 9/11. And 2 decades later, where do you sort of place terrorism in the array of national security threats facing the United States? It's pretty striking that, in Washington, we are very focused on great power competition, the rise of China, foreign interference in our election, a variety of different things. If you look at the polls, Americans put terrorism still quite high in the list of concerns that they care about. It's less, North Korea and Iran and things like that. But where do you sort of place terrorism now, 20 years after the creation of DHS?
Good question. It's important when ranking national security threats to remember that something may be a secondary level threat until it's not, until the moment it's not. Terrorism, the threat of terrorism to this country has evolved greatly since 9/11. I saw it evolve just on my watch at the Department of Defense and DHS from what we referred to as terrorist-directed attacks on the homeland to terrorist-inspired attacks through the internet and so forth. And the principal terrorist threat right now in the United States, frankly, is domestic-based, domestic-inspired terrorism. And that is what we've been seeing of late. The Anti-Defamation League, for example, has been tracking this for some time now and has been repeatedly pointing out that the principal terrorist threat to our homeland is right-wing, violent-inspired terrorism, domestic in nature. DHS was created by Congress in 2002 on the assumption that terrorism was an extraterritorial threat. And therefore, if you consolidate into one cabinet level department all the different ways somebody can enter our country, land, sea, and air, you're effectively dealing with terrorism. That model is somewhat outdated. And it's why I, for example, while I was in office, spent so much time on our CVE mission, countering violent extremism here at home. While I was in office also, I quickly came to the realization that if terrorism, counterterrorism is the cornerstone of the mission, the other cornerstone needs to be cybersecurity. And we've done a lot, both on my watch and after, frankly, on improving DHS's cybersecurity mission. I'm very proud of what CISA, under the leadership of Chris Krebs, has done to strengthen our election infrastructure cybersecurity, though he was fired for reasons I don't fully understand last week. Over.
Yeah, I think, well, I guess we shouldn't speculate on intent of why he's fired, but it seemed like he said the wrong things about the integrity of the election. And we'll get to CISA in just a moment. But Sue, let me go to you, and certainly if you have a view about DHS and its responsibilities, but also wanted to ask you this question about where you sort of rank terrorism as a threat, and maybe to drill down just a little bit on Jay's point of you've got the terrorists over there, the ISIS, the Al Qaeda, all of the different terrorist groups we've been tracking for a couple of decades now, and then this domestic problem here at home, and how you sort of think about what the responsibilities of the government should be going forward on that.
Yeah, what a great question, and thanks for having me. And everything Jay said, I support. So from an intelligence perspective, I'll talk about 3 things that I'd put in the bin. I'll start with terrorism, and I'll start with a particular kind, which is that associated with WMD, weapons of mass destruction, whether that is nuclear weapons or whether that is biological or chemical. I think those are low probability, high impact events. And when I think of DHS, from my vantage point as an intelligence officer, in a way, they're the transportation from a threat to an action to protect. And I think that if you look at the playbook a little bit that CISA effected with election security, what they did is they reached all the way to state and local. They reached all the way to the private sector. They exercised the heck out of it. So when we came to an election, you could see that there was a preparedness and a resilience. My question is, have we done the same thing with the risk of WMD in the hands of terrorists, and are we equally prepared? And I think pandemics taught us the same thing, where we certainly knew the pandemic was a strategic threat. And even though we had COOP-COG exercises, were we prepared all the way to the locality? And so if I think, to add to Jay's points about what I think are good new age focus for DHS, I would add pandemics. What's the border control issues there? I would add WMD. What's the connection with state and local and preparedness if you have that kind of event? And I'd certainly keep going with cybersecurity, because this is a digital world, and that is just so a low cost effective way to go.
Let me just follow up with you on this too. And I want to bring in, and Carrie, I'll go to you in a minute. I just want to bring in this question from one of the members of the audience about the threat of disinformation activities. This seemed to be super focused before the election, and now we've got our own problems, with the president who doesn't want to concede and all of this, and which it seems like it makes it a little hard to evaluate, kind of all else equal, because not all else is equal right now, but if all else equal, what the disinformation effect would have been ahead of the elections and how it's compared to 2016. Are we getting our hands on how to respond to this? But what's your sense of how the government is doing in dealing with disinformation, at least the kind coming from foreign actors?
So I think we're aware that it's real. Listen, trust and truth are the foundation of free and open societies. If you can't be confident in communications going from point A to point B in a protected fashion, and if you can't count on what you hear to be true, you're going to have to, you run the risk of undermining the basic tenets of democracies. So I think we know that that's something we need to deal with. Certainly, our adversaries have watched this and see that they can open up rifts or create opportunities for themselves through disinformation, whether that is disinformation about COVID vaccines or whether that is disinformation about societal behaviors. I think they certainly know it. I think there's a heartening moment here in that it's not just the government who is going to be expected to protect against disinformation. A lot of the transparency around this issue was really to get the citizenry involved in a little bit of critical thinking. And I don't know whether Twitter and Facebook have it quite right in terms of what they're doing to try and ensure the authenticity of information, but I like that they're making an attempt. So I think it is a incredibly powerful tool of our adversary, or any adversary, against an open society. But I think we have a moment here where everyone sees it, and we just have to bear down and create more rules around it, more rules about behavior, and we need to get the citizenry involved in critical thinking.
Great. Carrie, let me go to you. And so CISA has come up twice now. You've done a lot of work on election security during your time at CNAS, and then of course you were also in government when other issues that fall into CISA's bailiwick came about, including some of the major leaks and hacks that hit the intelligence community. And I wanted to ask what your sense is, both on the election security front, but also federal and IC cybersecurity, and what's left to be done there, given how, shall we say, consequential some of these leaks have been thus far. You're on mute, Carrie, and
Sorry, got it.
It would not be a virtual event without at least saying you're on mute at least once or twice. So.
At least one time. Yeah, there we go. Well, great to be with this very distinguished panel here. And so on CISA, first of all, with respect to the Director Krebs being fired last week, I think it's pretty apparent why he was fired. He was fired because CISA stood up a webpage called Rumor Control, which was intended to bat down originally foreign disinformation about threats to the election. And as more disinformation from even domestic sources continue to provide wrong information to Americans, CISA used that capacity to bat down rumors, in particular rumors about inadequate voting systems and technology about voting systems that was just not true. And it was that truth telling to the American public that finally got the CISA director fired by the president. What CISA was able to do was really remarkable, because what they did is they took the foreign threats to the election that we all know through bipartisan reviews of the Senate Intelligence Committee in 2016, the special counsel's review of Russian interference in the election 2016. And they worked with state and local partners. And that state and local partner part is so important because, as we know, it's not the federal government that runs elections. It happens by professionals who know how to run elections at the state and local level. But CISA helped to coordinate them, helped to get them resources, helped to educate them in order to harden the entire country's defenses when it came to the functioning of elections and voting systems. And so this election was a really smooth running election, especially given all of the challenges of the pandemic and coronavirus and people's health and safety and trying to run elections in that environment. And yet the actual mechanics of the election went extraordinarily well. Very few, if any, problems in the administration of the actual election. So I think that was a real success story. Of course, CISA was created as an entity. It was a component of DHS, but was formalized through legislation during the Trump administration. And so it's one real bright spot in the Department of Homeland Security of the last few years, which, as Jeh Johnson was describing earlier, otherwise in the Trump administration really has been so overly consumed with the immigration and border security issue. On your question with respect to hacks and leaks, so that takes us in a little different direction that hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about the intelligence community issues, but we really have been in a pervasive era of hacks and leaks. And one of the things I think the Biden and Harris administration will be looking to do is to really take another look at what the whole of government response is to addressing pervasive intellectual property theft on the part of some foreign nation states, continuation of criminal hacking activity. They can build on the successes that CISA has brought, but there still is a lot more work that can be done there.
Great. Well, let's go to some of those questions about the intelligence community. We saw just a little while ago today that Avril Haines, who is another board member of CNAS, along with Jay and others, has been named the nominee designate for Director of National Intelligence. And let me go to Jay, and then I want to bring in Sue here too on this. ODNI is about to enter its 15th anniversary. I think it's safe to say that we will enter an administration where the president has a very different approach to intelligence use, both personally and as policy matters than the current one. Reportedly, the president-elect is an avid consumer of intelligence, including briefings, including in-person PDB types of briefings and materials. So, the DNI could go in a number of different ways, leaning heavily into the aspect of the role of sort of the primary intelligence briefer to the president, or the role of the coordinator of the IC more broadly, or the role of managing the budget, or potentially other roles as well. So how do you see the sort of superstructure that now exists over the intelligence community and the best possible directions that it should go as we go forward here? Let me go to Jay first on that.
Sure. First, Avril is simply an extraordinary human being. I spent literally hundreds, if not thousands of hours working with her during the Obama administration. She's one of the hardest working people I know, and she'll be fantastic at DNI. I will confess that when the DNI bureaucracy was first created in 2002 by Congress, I was not a big fan of it, having been at the Pentagon once by that point, because I thought it was an added layer of unnecessary bureaucracy. I have to say now that I've become a fan of the way it works. I think Jim Clapper really did bring it a long way in coordinating all of the different intelligence agencies in the alphabet soup. And as a consumer of intelligence for a number of years in national security, I see now the virtue of doing it the way we do it. And it got to the point where I too am a big fan of briefings. It was the most important part of my day to read the daily intel and then get the verbal briefing later on. And it would all be coordinated through DNI. And every once in a while, you'd get a dissenting opinion out of the alphabet soup. And it would say dissenting opinion. And so I'd have the analyst come up to DHS headquarters, both majority and dissenting opinions, to explain their differing views. And the process works pretty well now. And I cannot emphasize the importance enough, if you're in national security, of consuming intelligence on a daily basis. It really is your eyes and ears for doing your job. And people who work with me when I was at Homeland Security will tell you that it was the first thing I did when I got to work. Then I'd spend an hour or half hour verbally getting the daily intel. And then if I had time left over, I would turn to the Washington Post, the New York Times, and others to see how the press was covering what I knew to be reality. And so I can't stress enough the importance of a well-running, functional, bipartisan, credible intelligence community.
Sue, I suspect you may have a thought or two on this. So what do you think?
Well, one, I'm smiling at Jay saying he wasn't initially a fan of the formation of the DNI. I was at the CIA, and we were like, what don't you understand about the word central? Why do we need this additional layer? I will tell you, in the years since, it's been instrumental in the bringing the FBI and DHS, the more homeland, the more domestic agencies, to be part of the same thing to achieve the whole of government responses that we need to adversarial intent. It keeps us from allowing them to hide here because the intelligence can't get it. So I'm a huge fan. Listen, the arc of the position of the DNI has been, it's at inception, it was really kind of oversight and policy adherence. In the middle years, it was about integration. And I think what Avril, who I couldn't agree more, is a fantastic choice, just for so many reasons. But I think her challenge is going to be, it is yes about the production and the conveyance of integrated, relevant intelligence, but there's also a leadership job that the DNI is going to have to do here for the intelligence community. There are a lot of things that it needs to address in terms of changed priorities, the introduction of much more information technology to be able to deal with the data that is now available, and the fact that this is a world where the threats are to and through information, and just making sure that the community isn't dragging its past of the Cold War and counterterrorism to such an extent that it's trying to deal with great power competition, global competitiveness with what's left over. So I think there's also a leadership job that she's going to have the opportunity. And there is one of the great powers of the Office of the DNI, in addition to being that single voice that can share the wisdom of the community with the president and the administration, is they have budget control. Mm-hmm. So if you're trying to shape toward a new future, you really do need that in order to help make some of the decisions rather than just carrying on the past. So great human, great time. Yes, that sage voice that allows intelligence to be brought to issues, but also there's going to be a leadership challenge here in terms of bringing the community into the dynamic environment that we have right now.
Great. And just to add my 2 cents of praise to Avril, I think she's one of the sharpest, hardest working, and flat out kindest,
just such a decent human
people that you will ever meet, and has that nearly unique combination of skills to be a truly exceptional leader of the intelligence community. So it's great to see. Jeh Corman, our Director of Communications, but in this format, more formally known as DJ Jeh, has an audience polling question to tee up. So Jeh, over to you.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much to the hundreds of folks that are on the live stream right now. Thank you for sending in your questions. Just scroll right below your video box on our webpage, cnas.org/live, and you can enter questions in the chat like the one we got before, or you can hit the ask a question button and drop a question in the Q&A. So there's a couple ways to ask questions, but we, of course, every time we do one of these pop-up events, we have questions for you to help shape our discussion. The first question up today, it's just been opened in the chat. We already see people voting. The first question is, which country should the Biden administration worry about most as the biggest national security threat to the United States? And your options are China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And as the votes come in, I'll be back in a little bit. But of course, I would love to know what the panel would vote if they were observing at home right now. And I'll be back in a little bit. Back to you, Richard.
All right, now you see why we call him DJ Jeh. Great, we'll come back on that. Carrie, let me go to you, and I want to. You can certainly answer that question, but I want to pull something out of that, and also ask Jay and Sue their views on this, and that is about how DOJ and FBI have handled a variety of national security related issues. But one of the patterns that we have seen through Obama administration into the Trump administration is use of criminal prosecutions to address national security threats, in particular, the indictments of Chinese nationals for the theft of intellectual property, Russian agents for interference in the 2016 election. And, do you have a sense of, do we believe this deters the activity? Does it have other implications that we should be aware of? Is this a big tool in our toolkit to deal with these kinds of national security threats, or is it kind of something we do on top of other more potentially consequential carrots and sticks? And then how do you see the efficacy of that going forward into a Biden administration?
So it's interesting because actually the use of criminal prosecution and bringing these major indictments against individual officers or foreign nationals who are involved in major cyber attack against the United States is actually a through line from the Obama administration through the Trump administration. It's one aspect of national security activity on behalf of the government that has been relatively consistent. So it was under the Obama administration that major indictments of Chinese nationals for cyber attacks were brought. And then more of those, plus the Russian indictments, the indictments of Russian officers for 2016 election interference, happened under this administration, under the special counsel. And so it's been consistent. So I expect it to continue as a tool. In terms of its value, obviously, we don't really expect, the government doesn't really expect these individuals to sit for trial in the United States. But what it does do is it communicates to the world, it communicates to the adversary, and it communicates to the public what is going on behind the scenes. And so there really is a significant transparency value, in addition to just the value of bringing using our justice system in order to bring consequence to individuals. And there are some marginal effects in terms of the individuals affected and their ability to travel and things like that. So I think what it can't be, and so I'm sure that this is something that the Biden-Harris administration will be thinking about it, is it can't be sort of one of the only things that we do. And so I expect one thing that we'll see in the future is more effort to sort of what is the overall whole of government strategy to approach these types of activities. I do just, if I can, Richard, I do want to follow up just for a second on the conversation you were having with both Sue and Jay on the institutions of ODNI and DHS. Because, you know, as a post 9/11 government national security lawyer, and then having been out for a long time, you know, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that these institutions, they're not just set it and forget it. In other words, just because we created the DNI and the Department of Homeland Security after the September 11th attacks and in response to them, doesn't mean that we can then just let the legislation stand as it always is. I don't believe in going backwards. My perspective is that we need to take these institutions and build on their successes, but that also they do need to modernize, and they need to have a forward-looking vision. And one of the most important things for that is for them to be able to adapt to the changing threat environment. It's not that some of the old threats are going away, but it's that they are compounded by new threats. And one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is the coronavirus pandemic. And, you know, these institutions that we're talking about today were the institutions created in response to the September 11 attacks. We now are having as many Americans die each day as died in those attacks on that one day. And so I would imagine that one of the things we'll be talking about in the future is how do we need to not throw out and start over with our institutions that better protect Americans from such a significant threat and international event, but how do we improve them so that the public can be better protected?
That's a great point, and certainly it's striking to see how active not just HHS, for example, is in the pandemic response, but DoD's got a role to play, and the intelligence community's got a role to play, and certainly DHS and things like that. Jay, before we go to you, let's find out the results of the poll. So, Shai, what are we looking at here?
All right, so our results from the poll are in.
Okay.
74% say China is the country, the biggest intel threat to the United States that the Biden administration should worry about. 18% with Russia. There was a little bit of back and forth between Russia and China, and then China just blew past Russia. And then 5% for Iran and 1% for North Korea.
All right. I get a little worried when I see 1% for North Korea, because every time the North Koreans see their number going too low, they want to do something to raise it. So
we have had every week someone come in and vote for North Korea when we talk about their threat level. So they have a fan.
Okay, North Korea, you're fine at 1%. Let's just keep it there. All right. So Jay, let me go to you on this question of prosecutions of, you know, foreign actors for national security reasons, particularly the kind of things we talked about. And then also maybe you could just say a word, given your role on the COVID response and reopening commission or task force, about the role of the various national security agencies in that over, you know, the next at least say 6 months or so.
Sure. So I want to go back to what we were just talking about, the rankings, most serious national security threat. You know, one of the problems with doing that exercise is what you just pointed out, Richard. 1% of the audience here, and I have to believe it's a pretty sophisticated audience, only 1% believe North Korea is the #1 threat. Each one of those countries on that list represents a threat of a different kind and character. And to, you know, put North Korea at 1% suggests to the unsophisticated consumer, oh, don't worry about them. Well, that's obviously not the case. It's a little like saying, you know, well, there's an 85% probability that so-and-so is going to be elected. And so we have to be careful with the rankings, because each one of those represents a different type of threat. So I know from personal experience that the Chinese government leaders in particular, get really, really upset when you indict Chinese government officials. Even if the defendant is indicted in absentia and never sees the inside of a federal courtroom in the US, it does have an impact I believe to some extent it has a deterrent impact because it's the US government spelling out what we know in terms of the criminal behavior of a foreign government official, and very often how we know it. And it tells the public the story of the crime, the national security crime, so to speak. I thought there was value in the Mueller indictments laying out as extensively as they did the Russian disinformation campaign from 2016, even though those who were indicted may never see the inside of a federal courtroom. When you talk about the federal criminal justice process in national security, you have to always remember the number of Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab terrorists who've been indicted in our federal criminal justice system, who've been brought to justice and are now serving very, very long prison sentences. So there very definitely is a role for federal criminal justice law enforcement in defending and protecting national security. Over.
Great.
Oh, I'm sorry, COVID.
Yep.
So whenever anybody asks me about COVID and DHS, it's a little like, you can't help but be an armchair quarterback because we're now very far along in addressing this pandemic. And it's easy to say I would have done it differently had I been back in the first inning. But it is clear to me from my own experience that FEMA should have been part of the national government's response to COVID from the beginning. FEMA is, in my view, the agency of our government best at deploying, marshaling resources like PPE, like ventilators, for example. This administration did not, in my judgment, make effective use of the Defense Production Act. And so there's simply a lot more we could have done at the national level with the resources we have and that we've trained to use over the years to shepherd resources and allocate them to the communities that needed them most at the time they needed them. And so there's been an underutilization there. I hope that our government at the national level is thinking now about the vaccine and how the vaccine can most effectively be deployed in the places for the people that need them most on a priority level. That's the next big challenge. Along the way, it's basic messaging to the American public about physical distancing, good hygiene, the mask, wear the mask. We're all in fatigue right now after 9 months of dealing with this virus. But we know what it takes to flatten the curve if people have the discipline to stick with what we know works.
Great. Sue, let me go to you on a question. Actually, let me try to combine. Well, I'll stick with one question from the audience. I won't combine it on you because this question is pretty broad and it says, how do you expect new technologies, for example, AI, to affect intelligence and DHS activities? I mean, that's a subject of, I don't know, 100 hours of discussion, but maybe you could pick a little bit there. There's both technologies that we want to protect, our 5G networks and things like that, technologies that the intelligence community wants to acquire to be able to use. And then there's technologies we want to keep out of the hands of others and things like that. So I guess maybe to break this down just a bit, kind of, are there top technology issues that you think are going to be on the front burner, over the next year? And then also, is there enough, how do I put this, technology fluency among the policymakers and kind of general leadership in the IC to be able to make as informed decisions as we would want on some of these pretty complicated technical questions?
Let's see. I'll answer in three bends. The first is, hey, listen, this is a technical world, and so many issues go through technology. For the intelligence community, it has got to win at being able to use the information that will help it answer its question more effectively and at speed. It's got to be able to deal with volume, draw good conclusions, integrate it into the human processes, and have more clarity and wisdom and insight. It's not as much that we're behind, it's that it has to become integrated into the way we do work. And so just the introduction of machine learning and artificial intelligence into the craft of intelligence from collection, processing, and analysis is really important and has to be a focus. At the exact same time, there has to be a national effort on AI assurance, because if you can't trust the data or the algorithms, you're going to have a hard time being able to operate at speed. So that's one. The second thing is technology leadership in general, and how we maintain that and how we protect it is going to be a huge national issue. It used to be that the secure technologies, the most important, were produced by the government. We knew how to control it. Now the most important technologies are being produced outside the government. We're trying to shut the barn door after they're already out. And we're going to have to balance this securing the technology and allowing technology leadership for our companies, because if we shut us down, that will not serve our purposes. So if it's me, I'm going to really emphasize leadership at DOT and Department of Commerce, and do the same sort of thing of bringing them into the intelligence family that you did with DHS and FBI years ago, because technology leadership and technology advance is going to be able to play. And to the third, your question about are our leaders and our leadership and our workforce technologically savvy enough? No. And where that comes into play at the leadership level is you cannot, if you are not comfortable with technology, if you are not comfortable with data and understand its limits and its abilities, you will view the introduction of technology as adding risk, and you will retard the introduction of new ideas. So we're really going to have to invest in technical leadership. If you're a leader, you have to be comfortable with technology today. We've got the workforce that has the ability. We got to work on the leadership that can lead them.
Great. Thank you. Shai, let's go to our next poll question here. And see what
Sure. Our next poll question up has to do with federal criminal prosecutions. Are federal criminal prosecutions useful tools for deterring national security and intel threats? For example, the indictments of Chinese nationals for IP threat, or for IP theft, Russian agents for election interference. And your options are yes, keep them up; no, fight fire with fire; a little of both, or none of the above. And we'll be back in a little bit with those results. Over to you, Richard.
All right, we'll see how persuasive the previous discussion was on members of the audience. But as we're waiting for that, Carrie, let me go to you, and I'd love to bring in Jay and Sue as well on this. And there's a question from the audience about domestic white extremism and whether it should be classified as a, quote, national security threat. And if it does that invite the involvement of the national security enterprise? Does DoD get involved? Or should it be kept as a law enforcement priority, within DHS and DOJ? Do we need legislation? So how do you think about that?
Sure. So first, let's just to set the table in terms of the way the government currently handles it. So domestic terrorism, the primary responsibility for investigating that falls to the FBI, not on the national security side, though, generally on the criminal investigative side. And remember, the intelligence community is foreign focused. So the entire enterprise of our intelligence community is focused on foreign intelligence threats, not domestic threats. And that's really important because we don't, in the United States, have an internal security system. In other words, a set of investigators that is looking at Americans for domestic activity. And that's why traditionally we reside the investigations into domestic terrorism at the FBI, and then we use DHS as a conduit for intelligence sharing through the Department of Homeland Security to intersect with state and locals. challenge is in changing that is what we don't want to do is create some type of internal security service that is looking at Americans based on their First Amendment activities. And that's the historical reason why we split out the criminal investigative part on the domestic terrorism side. However, we currently are in an environment where we are starting to see greater and greater threats on the domestic side. So one way to address that is to make sure that within the Justice Department, this is adequate. The investigation of domestic terrorism is adequately resourced, is adequately made a priority under the umbrella of the existing, and if they need to be modified at all, but under that umbrella of investigations that are conducted according to Attorney General guidelines with appropriate considerations for privacy and Fourth Amendment and First Amendment rights.
Jeh, I see you nodding your head at least some of those things. Is that generally concur with where you come down?
Yes, I couldn't say it any better myself. Carrie nailed it. Look, there's an impulse in this country, which we've seen, to label certain domestic groups or movements a terrorist organization. There is no legal mechanism for doing that. As Carrie points out, our government has the ability to designate an overseas terrorist organization a foreign terrorist organization. That is done by the State Department. But there is no legal mechanism for designating a domestic group or a movement to be a terrorist organization. It would have no legal effect. The laws under Title 18 should be adequate for dealing with people, groups, conspiracies that turn criminal in nature. I think Carrie is right that the Department of Justice, the FBI, need to constantly reevaluate whether the authorities they have, the tools they have, are adequate to deal with an evolving law enforcement threat picture, the threat of violent white nationalism that I talked about earlier. But it's against our values, it's against who we are as a nation to start labeling people and groups domestically as somehow terrorist organizations and the like. We have to be really, really careful there.
Great. Shai, why don't you give us the results of the poll and then also tee up our last question for the audience?
Sure. And our poll results were, I think most of the folks were really just we're in the middle on this. It'll be interesting to see with our next poll question, which we got 59% with a little of both. I'm going to bring up our next question where this will be really interesting to see the divisions on this one. And this is, which of these activities poses the more significant threat to U.S. national security? Intellectual property theft, cyber attacks, disinformation, or hacks and leaks? That poll is now open. The votes are already pouring in. And so I'll be back a little bit later with those results.
I have a vote on that one.
Okay, go for it.
But I'll wait. I don't want to influence anybody.
Okay, all right. We'll find out. Yeah, exactly. We'll find out the results and then we'll come to you on that. One thing, Sue, maybe I can go to you and then back to Jeh on this. Both from the intelligence, there's a question from the audience on climate and how that plays both. The questions about DHS, but I think the intelligence community and really just the broader national security enterprise is at question here, given that the incoming administration this may be one of the most dramatic policy shifts, going from, the president often is very dismissive of climate change and says, it snowed the other day and therefore it doesn't exist, all the way to, today, John Kerry appointed special presidential envoy for climate change. Is going to be a top foreign policy / national security, I think, / economic kind of priority for the incoming team. And that will therefore have ripple effects on the priorities and the activities of various agencies. So Sue, where's the intelligence community on this particular question? Where do you think it goes here? And then maybe, Jeh, I can ask you that from the DHS perspective.
So the intelligence community is going to have to figure out its priorities because there are a lot of them. But I would say that there are three that have emerged in the last year: pandemics, immigration, and climate, that are certainly national security challenges. They are. And the intelligence community in general has had a relatively light hand in terms of involvement of it. Certainly not the leadership position, even though we have. And part of that reason is because that is not typically where our strength and our collection strength is. I mean, our collection strength is born of 1947 and the things we did, and other people did it. But if you agree that it's a national security threat and you understand that intelligence is about the craft of being able to do with widely disparate information, being able to put it in a format that allows people to deal with that uncertain information with certainty and have an objectivity to it, it's hard to argue that intelligence community shouldn't have more of a role in those three issues. And that you see that as strife increases on each one of those, they're going to have ripple effects into an ecosystem of displaced persons, economic strife that leads to political and military strife. So I think they're going to have to get more involved. But it's going to be a question of figuring out what they have to contribute and what their other areas of focus will be. But my bet is they need to look at it pretty seriously, since those are significant national security threats.
Great. Shai, let's get the results from the poll, and then Jay can give us both his answer and the answer that he didn't want to sway the audience by revealing beforehand.
So every week there's always one question that is, there's a real hot debate. And here we had this week, neck and neck, cyber attacks and disinformation, 41% and 43% respectively. And then IP theft and hacks and leaks at 8% and 5%. So a real back and forth photo finish for cyber attacks and disinformation. Back to you.
All right, we've got to get Shai a radio show. He just enjoys this too much.
I agree.
Okay, Jay, go ahead.
Yeah,
I just want to play too, though.
I put disinformation right up there because disinformation is one of the drivers of the polarization we see right now in our politics. And given the polarized political environment, it's tough for our democracy to get stuff done. It's tough for our democracy to address all these other issues we've been talking about if there's a basic debate about whether the earth is flat or the earth is round. And so as long as we live in this environment where vast numbers of people in the American electorate are susceptible to disinformation out there, that is an underlying problem that affects our ability to solve these other problems that we face. On the issue of climate change, it is a Homeland Security matter, most immediately because of the severe weather events effect on aging infrastructure in this country. Bridges, tunnels, railroad tunnels. We got a taste of this, for example, with Hurricane Sandy here in the New York area. And DHS, FEMA specifically, is in a position to help evaluate our aging infrastructure and what is it that is most vulnerable to the increasing number of severe weather events that we see. Little known fact, DHS gives out hundreds of millions of dollars every year in grants to bolster Homeland Security. I hope we are continually evaluating whether we are adequately addressing the threat picture with those grants, including the effects of severe weather events. Over.
Carrie, I ask you to come in on this question of disinformation. You've done a lot of work in this area, and it seems, as Jay is saying, to run a democracy effectively, you need at least two things, right? You need a shared understanding of reality and some basic level of trust. And it looks like both of those are going out the window to some degree. And that's a gigantic pressure point for our open society and our democracy. So one, and without leading the witness here, do you put the same priority on disinformation as Jeh did? And also, I mean, what do we do about this?
Well, I tend to look at all of the four things as sort of different sides of the same die, really, when we're looking at because they all pertain to the information environment and some either theft of information in it or manipulation of it. So, you know, lawyer fighting the hypothetical. But I will say there's an aspect to this that I think is relevant to the intelligence community. And I'd be curious what Jeh and Sue think about this as well, which is that traditionally the intelligence community's role has been to provide information and warning to policymakers and the president being the primary consumer, the number one customer of that information. One of the questions that I have going forward that has, you know, been in some of my work has been the concept of transparency and what the intelligence community's obligations are as something that is funded by taxpayers to the public to provide warning. Now we have the Congress and the intelligence committees that are supposed to be that proxy between the intelligence community and the public. But in some ways, particularly in the House in recent years, we've seen a breakdown in the effectiveness of that intelligence oversight. Hopefully that will change with the new Congress. But when it comes to disinformation, one of the things that I think we need to be thinking about is what is the intelligence community's obligations to help get to ground truth. We started our conversation today talking about CISA and how that played within DHS, that entity played an important role in establishing ground truth. We also saw, drawing on lessons from 2016 election interference, we saw a real concerted effort on the part of multiple intelligence leaders this summer, from an individual who is in the DNI's, the ODNI office, combined with the FBI director and the CISA director and the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, all engaging in public messaging. So for example, they appeared in a video together. They issued statements together talking about, here's what we know about foreign interference. Now, some of those statements were criticized, some, you know, it didn't go as far as some would like, but it really was a very big shift in terms of the transparency. And with respect to some of the other threats, you know, one of the things that I think we'll have to think about going forward is in order to beat down some of this disinformation, what role is there for the intelligence community to play in it or not?
Richard,
Great.
can I jump in on that one?
Yeah, I was going to say, I saw you nodding vigorously.
Yeah. Yeah, totally agree, Carrie. I think the way to think about it is who are the decision makers and where is the threat surface, right? And what we know now is the threat surface is the private sector and our citizenry. And so you have to provide them with the information because they're also the decision makers. They're making decisions about national security with their actions and not. So I think a move toward transparency is really important. I've been really proud since 2016 that the IC has done it with other elements. I will say they're going to have to develop a little bit more craft around how you talk to, you know, there's an arcanity to intelligence and there's an arcanity to intelligence analysis. And so when we talk to the government, everyone kind of understands its limitations. So in order to talk more to the public, more openly about it, they're going to have to develop some craft about how you give enough information. And Jeh, you know this, we had to learn that about how we talk to companies in cybersecurity. When we first started talking as an intelligence community, we were giving the information we wanted to give, but it was not the information that was really useful to them. So I think they'll need to be in advance, but I think it's a really important element going forward.
And then there's the other facet, this second prong of what you need for democracy, trust. And so that's going to have to, you know, get some attention too. All right, well, we're at time. So Jeh, Sue, Carrie, thank you so much for spending an hour to talk over these issues. We covered a lot of territory and I think it's a great discussion. Thank you for the audience for tuning in, for asking questions and answering the poll questions and everything else. We will continue to take opportunities to do discussions like these on what's to come as the opportunity arises. So watch this space for more. But thank you once again to our speakers and to you in the audience, and of course to our crack technical team, including but not limited to DJ Shy for doing everything they've done. Thanks everybody. Have a great Thanksgiving, and we'll see you again.